We need to write chapter 1 of a 12-chapter sci-fi story titled Abandoned in the Nebula. A damaged scout ship holds the galaxy's darkest secret. The instruction: output only narrative text. And write chapter 1 of 12. Build extreme tension. Each chapter must be very long and incredibly detailed. No preamble, just the narrative. We need to imagine a story so far, none given, so we start fresh. The title suggests a scout ship abandoned in a nebula carrying a dark secret. We need to establish a setting, characters, a situation of extreme tension, possibly a salvage crew or a lone pilot discovering the ship. Let's create a detailed opening. I'll write a long, detailed chapter. Focus on sensory details, atmosphere, building dread. The scout ship is damaged, floating in a nebula. Perhaps a salvage team named the Nebula W. Wraith finds it, or a single scout. I'll go with a small crew on a salvage vessel. The tension. Something is wrong with the derelict ship, it's not just damaged. Maybe it's emitting a signal or there's a strange energy. The dark secret. Perhaps it contains an alien artifact or a warning. But we only need chapter 1. Introduction, discovery, first hints of danger. I'll write in third person limited, perhaps from the perspective of the captain or first officer. Use vivid descriptions, the nebula's colors, the silence, the eerie feeling. The ship's name, the Veil D answer as salvage ship. The derelict, the errant Wisper, a scout ship. Start with the crew approaching. Build tension through subtle anomalies, systems glitching, a feeling of being watched, a strange hum. End chapter with a cliffhanger. They find a log entry or a discovered object that hints at the secret. Let me write. The void before them was not empty. It was a bruise of violet and tarnished gold, a wound in the firmament that bled light trapped for millennia. The nebula, designated NGC 7402 by the Galactic Cartography Bureau, but known to prospectors and salvagers as the Lament of Lysindra, stretched across 6 parsecs of twisted gas and stellar cinders. Inside its veils, the stars themselves seemed to weep. Captain Alara then watched the forward display, her face a mask of still water. The salvage vessel Veil Dancer was a slab of composite and corrosion, a converted ore hauler that had seen better centuries. Its hull vibrated with a low shudder, a constant complaint from the refitted gravity drive. The ship was too old for this kind of work, too frail for the nebula's ionic storms, but the debt ledger in her cabin didn't care about frailty. "Reading is stable," said Kaz, her sensor operator, his voice a dry rasp. He was a thin man with skin the color of old parchment, his eyes half-lidded as he listened to the frequencies hissing through the nebula. "The derelict is exactly where the beacon data said, 400 clicks off the port bow, drifting with the current." "Visual?" Alara asked. Kaz tapped a command. The main screen flickered, resolving through the false color haze of the nebula's spectral emissions. At first, there was only the swirl of ochre and cerulean. Then the image sharpened, and the ship emerged from the fog like a corpse surfacing from deep water. It was a Celerity-class scout. Long, sleek, built for speed and stealth. Its hull was a matte charcoal that absorbed light, but the ship was no longer whole. A section of the forward fuselage had been torn open. The edges of the breach curled inward as if the metal had melted and then frozen in place. The rear engine nacelles were dark, one of them missing entirely. Slow drifts of debris, shattered antennae, flakes of armor orbited the wreck like mourners. "That's not collision damage," said Wren, the engineer, from the back of the bridge. She was a large woman with grease embedded in the lines of her palms, and she had seen more wrecks than most. "That's precision cutting. Something ripped that bay open by design." Alara felt the cold settle deeper into her spine. "Registry," Kaz worked his console. "Transponder is dead, but I'm getting a faint hull signature, the errant Whisper, last registered to the Arcturus Naval Survey. Disappeared 16 years ago, presumed lost in the Cygnus Rift. That's 300 light-years from here. A survey ship doesn't end up in a nebula 300 light-years off course unless it was put there," Alara said. She turned from the display. "Wren, I want a full sweep before we dock. Ion scatter, thermal, gravimetric. If there's a mine attached to that hull, I want to know before we're paced." Wren nodded and left the bridge. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the steady drip of condensation from a cracked coolant pipe somewhere in the ceiling. The Veil Dancer's bridge was a cramped space, smelling of recycled air and old fear. Every surface was worn smooth by countless hands, every console flickering with the amber light of pre-warning. Alara stepped closer to the main screen. The errant whisper rotated slowly, its damaged side coming into view. The interior of the breach was black, but not empty. She could see the gleam of something reflective, a curve of metallic surface deeper inside the ship. It wasn't part of the scout's design. Kaz, what's the energy reading from that open section? Nothing. Dead. No power signatures, no thermal variants. That ship is a tomb. Then why does it feel like it's waiting for us? Alara muttered. Kaz didn't answer. He was staring at his own secondary screen, his brow furrowed. Captain, I'm getting a ghost signal, very faint. It's not a standard beacon. It's a repeating wave pattern, but it's been heavily modulated, almost like a code, but I can't parse it. Origin. The scout. Deep inside, the signal is coming from the core of the ship, maybe the data vault. Alara felt a pull that was equal parts greed and deep unease. A survey ship that had vanished 16 years ago, carrying a hidden signal inside a locked vault. That was the kind of find that could clear her debt 10 times over. It was also the kind of find that got people killed. Prepare a boarding party, she said. Full hazard suits. We're going in. The docking procedure was a slow, agonizing dance. The Veil Dancer extended its magnetic grapples, and the errant whisper accepted them with a shudder that reverberated through the deck plates. The two ships kissed with a groan of metal. Alara, Kaz, and Ren stood in the airlock, their suits humming with internal pressure. The suits were old, the seals patched, the helmet visors scratched. But they were all they had. The outer hatch opened. The umbilical tunnel extended, a flexible tube of composite that latched onto the scout's emergency airlock. The seal held. The inner door cycled open. The air inside the errant whisper was still, not merely stagnant, but as if it had been emptied of all motion. The emergency lights cast a blood-red glow along the corridors. The walls were slick with a fine frost, and the temperature was just above freezing. Alara stepped in first, her boots crunching on a thin layer of ice. The corridor was narrow, designed for a crew of 3. The walls were lined with storage compartments, all of them open, their contents disgorged, ration packs, medical kits, data pads. Everything was scattered as if the ship had been shaken by a giant hand. Check the crew quarters, Alara said. I want to know where they went. Ren moved to the first door. It was stuck. She put her shoulder against it and it gave with a screech. The cabin inside was empty. The bunk was made, a single personal data pad on the pillow. On the screen, a message had been left, half-typed, the cursor blinking. It read, "Why do we keep hearing footsteps in the hall when there is no one else aboard?" Alara's throat tightened. She reached out and touched the screen. The cursor blinked again as if waiting for her to finish the sentence. "Captain," Kaz said from the corridor, "you need to see this." She stepped back out. Kaz was pointing at the bulkhead near the breach. The metal had been scored not by tools but by something that had left deep, parallel grooves. The marks were clustered as if something had clawed at the wall trying to dig its way through. The grooves ended at a sealed hatch, the door to the scout's data vault. The hatch was covered in symbols. Not standard galactic script, not any language Alara recognized. They were carved into the metal, crude and deep, as if etched by a fingernail. The symbols seemed to shift in the red light, forming patterns that made her eyes ache. "That's not survey issue," Ren said, her voice low. "No," Alara agreed. "It's a warning." She looked at the vault door. It was the only thing on the ship that still had power. A small indicator light glowed green, steady and patient. The door was unlocked. It was waiting for them. Alara placed her hand on the release. The mechanism hissed. The door swung open, revealing a space no larger than a closet. Inside, on a single pedestal, sat a cube. It was about the size of a human head, made of a material that was not metal, not ceramic, not any substance she could name. It was a deep, impossible black, and it seemed to drink the light around it. The surface was smooth, save for a single line that ran around its equator, a hair-thin seam. The ghost signal was coming from inside the cube. She could hear it now, a low hum that vibrated in her bones. It was not a mechanical sound. It was a voice or something that pretended to be a voice. It was speaking, but not in words. It was speaking in images, in feelings, in a language that bypassed the ears and went straight into the mind. You are the first to listen. Alara stumbled back. The cube hummed louder. The red emergency lights flickered. The claw marks on the walls seemed to writhe. "Seal the vault," she ordered. "Now." But Ren was already moving, not to seal the door but to reach for the cube. Her hand was extended, her eyes vacant. Alara grabbed her arm, but Ren was stronger. She pulled free, her fingers closing around the cube. The line on the cube split. A seam of light erupted, blinding, searing. The hum became a scream. And then the errant whisper began to drift, not with the nebula current but against it. The ship was no longer dead. It was waking up. Chapter 2. The awakening of the whisper. The scream from the cube did not stop. It did not fade or echo. It simply changed, from a sound that filled the corridor into a vibration that settled deep in Alara's skull, behind her eyes, in the marrow of her bones. Ren's hand was still clamped around the black object, her knuckles white, her face slack. The seam of light had not widened. It had become a permanent crack, spilling a radiance that cast no shadows, a light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Ren," Alara said, her voice tight. "Let go." Ren did not respond. Her eyes were open, but they were not looking at the cube. They were looking through it at something else, something only she could see. Her lips moved, forming words that made no sound. The cube hummed in response, a low, resonant note that vibrated through the deck plates. Kaz was at Alara's side, his hand on the plasma cutter, his face pale in the strange light. "We need to get that away from her. If I pull her off, I don't know what happens," Alara said. "The signal changed when she touched it. It's not just transmitting anymore. It's interacting." The cube's hum shifted, becoming more complex, layered. Alara felt it in her chest, a second heartbeat, out of sync with her own. The ghost signal she had heard before was gone, replaced by something else, something that was not a message but a presence. It was in the corridor with them, pressing against her skin, cold and patient. Ren blinked. Her hand loosened but did not release the cube. She turned her head slowly, as if moving through water, and looked at Alara. Her eyes were normal again, but there was something behind them, a depth that had not been there before. "It's not a warning," Ren said. Her voice was flat, hollow. "It's a key." "A key to what?" Alara asked. Ren's gaze drifted to the sealed hatch behind them, the one covered in claw marks and shifting symbols. To the door, the one they tried to claw through, the one they sealed themselves in to escape. Alara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Escape from what?" Ren did not answer. She looked back at the cube, and the seam of light pulsed in time with her breathing. The ship groaned around them, metal flexing and settling, but the sound was different now. It was not the random creaking of a derelict. It was rhythmic, deliberate. The errant whisper was breathing. "The engines are coming online," Kaz said, his eyes fixed on his wrist console. "Life support is cycling. The nav array is drawing power. This ship hasn't been dead, Captain. It's been waiting." Alara turned to the vault door, to the symbols carved into the metal. She looked at them now with new eyes, not as a warning, but as a description. The crude, deep grooves were not random. They were a diagram, a map of something. The shifting patterns that made her eyes ache were not a trick of the light. They were a language, and now that the cube was active, she could almost understand it. The symbols were telling her how to open the door. "We need to get back to the shuttle," Alara said. "Now." "The shuttle is dead," Ren said. "The cube killed it. When I touched it, the power surge fried every system on the Whisper that wasn't already offline. The shuttle's reactor is cold. We're not going anywhere." Alara stared at her. "You knew that would happen." Ren met her gaze, and for a moment, Alara saw something like fear in her eyes. But it was not fear of the cube. It was fear of what she had done and what she was about to do. "I didn't know," Ren said, "but I understand it now. The cube is not a device, it's a fragment, a piece of something larger. It has been waiting for a mind to connect with, a consciousness that could interpret its purpose. The crew of this ship tried to destroy it. They sealed it in the vault and carved the warnings to keep others away, but they failed. The cube waited, and now we are here." The ship lurched. Not a drift, but a deliberate movement, a course correction. The red emergency lights flickered and died, replaced by a soft, ambient glow that came from the walls themselves. The light was the same color as the cube's seam, a pale, sterile white that made everything look washed out, unreal. Alara moved to the nearest viewport. The nebula was still there, a swirling mass of gas and dust, but it was no longer static. The currents were shifting, spiraling around the whisper as if the ship were at the center of a slow, deliberate whirlpool. The stars beyond were dimming, their light swallowed by something vast and dark that was moving through the nebula, something that was responding to the cube's signal. "What did you do?" Alara whispered. Ren joined her at the viewport, the cube still in her hand. The seam of light had closed, but the surface of the object was no longer black. It was translucent, filled with swirling patterns that mirrored the nebula outside. Ren's reflection in the viewport was wrong. Her eyes were too bright, her face too still. She looked like a ghost wearing Ren's skin. "I didn't do anything," Ren said. "I only listened. The cube showed me what happened here. The crew of the Whisper found something in the nebula, something ancient and intelligent. They tried to communicate with it, but they made a mistake. They opened a door that should have stayed closed. The thing that came through was not hostile, it was hungry. It consumed them, not their bodies, but their minds. It took their memories, their knowledge, their consciousness. It used them to learn, to grow, to understand." She paused, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the viewport. "The cube is the last remnant of that entity. The crew managed to trap it, to isolate a fragment of its consciousness and seal it in the vault. But they could not destroy it. They could only contain it. And now it has found a new host." Alara's hand went to her sidearm. "You're not Ren anymore." Ren turned to face her, and for a moment her expression was Ren's, full of fear and regret. "I'm still here, Captain, but so is it. It's in my head, in my thoughts. It's not controlling me, it's showing me things, it wants to be understood, it wants to complete itself." "Complete itself how?" Kaz asked, his voice steady, his hand on his own weapon. Ren looked at the cube. "The fragment is incomplete. It needs the rest of the entity to become whole again. The entity is out there in the nebula waiting. The cube has been calling to it for centuries, but there was no one to hear, no one to carry the signal. Now there is. The whisper is taking us to the source." The ship lurched again, harder this time. The ambient light flickered and the deck tilted beneath their feet. Alarms blared, a discordant wail that echoed through the corridors. Kaz grabbed a handrail, his console glowing red with warnings. "The ship is accelerating," he said. "We're being pulled into the nebula core. The gravitational field is intense. If we go much deeper, the shuttle won't be able to extract us even if it were functional." Alara made a decision. She drew her sidearm and aimed it at Ren's hand at the cube. "Drop it, Ren. Drop it now or I will shoot." Ren looked at the weapon, then at Alara. Her eyes were clear, rational. "You can't destroy it, Captain. The crew of the Whisper tried. They used plasma cutters, explosives, even a directed energy pulse that should have vaporized it. Nothing worked. The fragment is indestructible. It exists outside the normal laws of physics. Shooting me will only release it, and it will find another host, Kaz or you. Then we seal it in the vault again," Alara said. "We lock it away and we find another way off this ship." Ren shook her head. "The vault is empty now. The seal is broken. The fragment has been activated. There is no going back. The only way to stop this is to complete the connection, to take the fragment to the entity and let them merge. Once they are whole, the entity will have no need for us. It will let us go." "You don't know that," Alara said. "I do," Ren said. It showed me everything." The ship shuddered and the viewport went dark. The nebula was gone, replaced by a void so absolute that it seemed to swallow the light from the Whisper itself. The ambient glow flickered and died, leaving them in darkness, lit only by the pale radiance of the cube in Ren's hand. Then the voice returned. It was not a sound. It was a pressure in Alara's mind, a weight that pressed down on her thoughts, forcing them aside to make room for something else. Images flashed behind her eyes, too fast to process, too strange to comprehend. She saw vast structures made of light, beings that existed in dimensions she could not perceive. a war that had been fought across millennia and galaxies. She saw the entity not as a monster but as a child, lonely and afraid, reaching out for something it had lost. And she saw the truth. The crew of the errant Whisper had not been consumed. They had been invited. The entity had offered them a place in its consciousness, a union that would transcend death and individuality. They had refused. They had fought. They had carved the warnings into the walls, not to protect others, but to protect themselves, to remind themselves of what they had rejected. The cube was not a prison. It was a gift. Alara opened her eyes. She was on her knees, her sidearm on the deck beside her. Kaz was slumped against the bulkhead, his face pale, his eyes wide. Ren was standing over them, the cube held high, its light casting long shadows that danced on the walls. "You see it now," Ren said. "You understand." Alara nodded, her throat tight. "It's not a threat, it's an offer." "Yes," Ren said. "And we have to decide, do we accept? Or do we end up like the crew, trapped in a dead ship, drifting forever in the nebula, waiting for someone else to make the choice we were too afraid to make?" The ship groaned, and the void outside the viewport began to shimmer. Shapes were forming in the darkness, vast and fluid, made of light and shadow and something that was neither. They were moving toward the Whisper, drawn by the cube's signal, drawn by the fragment calling out to the whole. Alara looked at Ren, at the cube, at the approaching entity. She thought of the galaxy, of the billions of lives that had no idea what was waiting in the nebula. She thought of the Survey Corps, of her crew, of the promise she had made to bring them home. And she knew there was no going back. "We accept," she said. The cube pulsed. The ship shuddered. And the entity reached out to touch them. Chapter 3. The shattered signal. The moment the entity's touch brushed against the hull of the errant Whisper, the ship convulsed as though struck by a gravitational wave. Metal screamed, bulkheads flexed, and the lights surged in a violent cascade before plunging them back into the cube's pale glow. Alara's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't pain she felt, it was intrusion. Something vast and alien was threading itself through her consciousness, weaving strands of thought that weren't hers into the fabric of her mind. Kaz groaned, clutching his head. His voice was ragged, torn from him like a confession. "Get it out." "Alara, it's inside me." But Ren stood rigid, his eyes wide and unblinking, transfixed by the cube's radiance. His lips moved soundlessly, as though he were repeating words whispered directly into his skull. The cube pulsed again, and the void outside the viewport rippled like disturbed water. The shapes, those impossible geometries of light and shadow, drew closer, their forms shifting in ways that defied Euclidean logic. They weren't approaching in space. They were approaching in thought, collapsing the distance between minds rather than matter. Alara forced herself to stand, her legs trembling. "Hold on, Kaz, don't fight it. If you resist, it tears deeper." She wasn't sure how she knew that, but the knowledge was absolute, carved into her brain by the entity's presence. Kaz's eyes snapped to hers, bloodshot and desperate. "And if I don't resist, what happens then? Do I vanish like the others? Do I stop being me?" The ship's systems flickered alive for a heartbeat, then died again. A distorted voice bled through the comms, not mechanical, not human, but something in between. It was the Whisper itself, speaking with borrowed tones. "Union is survival, isolation is decay." Ren lowered the cube, his face illuminated by its glow. "It's offering us a choice, but it's not just about us. It's about the galaxy. If we accept, we carry it back. If we refuse, it stays here, waiting for the next crew to stumble into its reach." Alara's pulse hammered in her ears. She thought of the Survey Corps, of the fragile balance of power across the colonies, of the wars fought over scraps of technology far less dangerous than this. If the entity spread beyond the nebula, it wouldn't just change civilizations. It would erase them, dissolve them into its collective consciousness. The hull shuddered again. A fracture split across the viewport, spiderwebbing outward. Beyond it, the shapes pressed closer, their light bleeding into the ship like veins of fire. The cube's glow intensified, synchronizing with the rhythm of the entity's pulse. Kaz staggered to his feet, his voice hoarse. "We can't take this back. We can't let it out." "Alara, you know what happens if the Corps gets their hands on it. They'll weaponize it. They'll force it into soldiers, into colonies. It won't be a gift, it'll be a curse." Ren's jaw tightened. Or it could save us. Imagine a galaxy united, no more war, no more hunger. We'd be more than human. We'd be infinite. Alara's mind reeled. The entity's thoughts pressed harder, showing her visions. Worlds healed, civilizations thriving, but also faces dissolving into light, individuality erased, billions of voices screaming as they merged into one. The truth was a paradox, salvation and annihilation indistinguishable. The cube pulsed again. The ship's engines roared to life without command, systems aligning themselves to a trajectory Alara hadn't set. The whisper was being guided, no, pulled toward the heart of the nebula, deeper into the entity's domain. Alara grabbed the console, forcing manual override. It's steering us. It wants us closer. If we go deeper, we may never come back. Kaz slammed his fist against the bulkhead. Then we fight it. We destroy the cube before it drags us in. Ren's hand shot out, clutching the cube protectively. His voice was sharp, almost feral. No, if you destroy it, you destroy our only chance. Don't you see? It chose us. It's not forcing us, it's asking. The tension snapped taut, a wire ready to break. Alara stood between them, her mind torn in two directions. The entity's presence pressed harder, whispering promises of eternity, of unity, of peace. But beneath it, she felt something darker, a hunger, a need to spread, to consume. The viewport cracked again, shards of glass trembling in their frame. The shapes outside were no longer distant. They were here, pressing against the hull, their light bleeding through the fractures. The whisper groaned like a dying beast. Alara raised her sidearm, her hand shaking. Ren, put the cube down. Ren's eyes blazed with conviction. If you shoot me, you doom us all. If you destroy it, you doom the galaxy. This is bigger than us, Alara, bigger than the core, bigger than humanity. Kaz stepped forward, his voice low, dangerous. And if you're wrong, if it's not salvation but infection, then you've just handed the galaxy to a parasite. The cube pulsed violently, a shockwave rippling through the ship. The lights flared, and for a moment Alara saw them, not as crew, not as individuals, but as fragments of a vast tapestry, threads waiting to be woven into something greater. She felt herself slipping, her identity fraying at the edges. She clenched her jaw, forcing the thought back. We decide now, accept or resist. There's no middle ground. The entity's voice filled the ship, resonant and absolute. Choose. The hull screamed. The viewport shattered, and the void reached in. Alara's finger tightened on the trigger. The cube burned in Ren's hand. Kaz lunged forward, and the errant whisper plunged into the heart of the nebula. Chapter 4. The fractured silence. The moment the viewport shattered, silence did not follow. Instead, the ship screamed, a metallic shriek that reverberated through every corridor, every bulkhead, every nerve of the crew. The nebula poured in, not as matter, but as light, as thought, as something that bent the rules of physics until they cracked. Alara staggered back, her sidearm still raised, but the void itself seemed to press against her skin, crawling into her mind. The cube in Ren's hand burned brighter, its edges dissolving into streams of symbols that rearranged themselves faster than the eye could follow. Kaz slammed into Ren, trying to wrench the cube free. The two collided against the console, sparks flying as systems overloaded. The ship's alarms wailed, but their voices were drowned beneath something deeper, a resonance, a chorus that was not sound but intent. The entity spoke again, but this time it was not words, it was sensation. Alara felt her lungs fill with ice, her veins thrum with fire, her memories unravel and rethread into something alien. She saw herself standing on 1,000 worlds, speaking with 1,000 mouths, all connected by the same pulse. She screamed, forcing herself back into her body. Stop, both of you! But Ren's eyes were no longer his own. They glowed with the same fractured light as the nebula outside. His voice was layered, distorted, carrying echoes of countless others. You don't understand. It's not asking us to choose, it's already chosen. We are the vessel. Kaz snarled, his grip tightening on Ren's wrist. Then I'll break the vessel before it infects us all. The cube pulsed again, and the ship lurched violently. Gravity inverted for a heartbeat, sending them crashing against the ceiling before slamming them back to the floor. Panels tore free, Wires dangled like veins spilling from the Whisper's wounded body. Alara crawled toward the console, her fingers bleeding as she forced manual input. The ship resisted her commands, systems rewriting themselves faster than she could counter. Every override was undone, every firewall breached. The Whisper was no longer theirs, it was becoming something else. The nebula pressed closer, shapes forming in the fractured light. They were not ships, not creatures, but impressions, vast silhouettes that suggested intelligence without form. They hovered just beyond the hull, watching, waiting. Alara's voice cracked as she shouted over the chaos. "Ren, if you don't let go, it'll consume us." Ren turned, his face half shadow, half light. "Don't you see, that's the point. We're not meant to resist, we're meant to become." Kaz roared, driving his fist into Ren's jaw. The cube slipped from Ren's grasp, tumbling across the deck. The moment it touched the floor, the ship convulsed, a shockwave tearing through its frame. The lights died. For a heartbeat there was nothing, no sound, no motion, no breath. Then the silence fractured. The cube rose from the floor, levitating, spinning faster and faster until it blurred into a sphere of light. The entity's voice returned, louder, sharper, undeniable. "You are mine." The hull buckled inward as though the nebula itself was inhaling the Whisper. Alara felt her bones vibrate, her thoughts scatter. Kaz clutched the bulkhead, his teeth bared in defiance. Ren knelt, his arms spread wide, welcoming the collapse. And in that moment, Alara realized the truth. The nebula was not outside. It was inside. It had always been inside. The cube was not a beacon, it was a seed. And the Whisper was the soil. Her finger tightened on the trigger again, but she hesitated. If she destroyed the cube now, would it save them? Or would it unleash something far worse? The ship groaned, its frame twisting. The nebula's light poured through every crack, every seam, until the Whisper was no longer a vessel but a cocoon. Alara's breath caught in her throat. They were no longer traveling deeper into the nebula. The nebula was traveling deeper into them. The tension is now unbearable, the line between salvation and annihilation thinner than a whisper. Chapter 5 will decide whether Alara pulls the trigger or whether the galaxy itself is rewritten. We need to write Chapter 5 of the story. The previous chapter ended with Alara hesitating to destroy the cube, realizing the nebula is inside them. The tension is extreme. This chapter must continue from that moment. The cube is spinning, the ship is transforming. Alara must decide. The chapter should be very long and detailed, building suspense. We need to show the consequences of her decision or lack thereof. The entity's voice is present. Possibly Ren is still there. Kaz is there. The chapter title or content. Chapter 5. The trigger or similar. We'll write narrative only, no preamble. Chapter 5. The trigger. Alara's finger trembled against the cold metal of the trigger. The cube hung in the air before her, a churning sphere of light that pulsed with the rhythm of a heartbeat not her own. The ship screamed around her, metal whining, atmosphere venting in sharp hisses, the floor buckling underfoot. But the sounds were dim, muffled, as if the nebula had already begun to claim her senses. The entity's voice resonated not in her ears but in her bones, in the marrow of her thoughts. "You are mine." The words repeated, a loop, a mantra, a seal. Each syllable pressed deeper into her consciousness, rewriting the architecture of her mind. She saw flashes, not memories but impositions. A vast city of light, geometry without edges, beings that moved through dimensions as easily as she breathed. And at the center of it all, a presence that was not a god but something older, something that had watched civilizations rise and fall like tides. Kaz's roar cut through the haze. He had thrown himself at Ren, pinning him against the buckled bulkhead, but Ren's eyes were glassy, his lips moving in a silent chant. The cube's light reflected in his pupils, turning them into molten gold. He was gone, already absorbed, already part of the thing that was consuming them. "Alara," Kaz's voice was raw, desperate. "Do it, end this." Her hand shook. The cube spun faster, and with each rotation the ship's hull groaned, twisting inward. The nebula's light poured through the cracks like liquid fire, pooling on the deck, rising, taking shape. Silhouettes formed not of creatures but of possibilities. She saw herself standing beside a throne of stars, a crown of light upon her brow. She saw Kaz kneeling, his defiance broken, his spirit hollowed. She saw Ren laughing, his body dissolving into the same light that now filled the cabin. The entity's voice softened, almost tender. You do not need to pull the trigger, you only need to let go of fear, let go of self, become what you were always meant to be. Alara's finger eased. The trigger lightened. The cube slowed, its rotation decelerating as if it sensed her surrender. The light dimmed, the silhouettes receded, and for a moment the ship was quiet. The hissing stopped. The groaning ceased. The only sound was her own ragged breath. She looked at the cube. It was no longer a sphere of chaotic light. It had become a perfect crystal, faceted, clear, containing a tiny spark at its core. The spark was warm, inviting. It hummed with a frequency that resonated with her deepest self, the part of her that had always felt alone, always searched for meaning among the stars. Ilara! Kaz's voice was a whisper now. Don't, please. But she could not hear him. The crystal was speaking to her, not in words but in feelings. It showed her the galaxy united not by force but by understanding. It showed her the end of war, of suffering, of entropy. It showed her a universe where every soul was woven into a single tapestry, where death was merely a transition, where loneliness was an impossibility. And then it showed her the cost. 1,000,000,000,000 strands of consciousness, each one a unique life, pulled taut, stretched, and then dissolved into the same light. The tapestry was beautiful, but it was also a shroud. Every individual, every culture, every memory, all merged into a single, eternal note. The price of unity was the loss of everything that made life worth living. Her finger tightened again. The crystal pulsed once, twice. A third pulse sent a shockwave through the ship. The hull split along a seam, and the nebula poured in, not as light but as substance. A gas that shimmered with iridescent colors, that clung to her skin, that seeped into her lungs. She choked, but the gas was not harmful. It was filling her, connecting her to the cube, to the entity, to the nebula itself. She saw Ren's face, now peaceful, his body already dissolving into the gas. He was smiling. It's beautiful, he breathed. Don't you see, it's not an end. It's a beginning. Kaz coughed, his hand reaching for her. Ilara, if you don't fire, I will. But he was too far. The gas had thickened, forming a barrier between them. She could barely see him, only the outline of his silhouette against the glow. The cube hung before her, close enough to touch. The crystal was warm, inviting, promising. She thought of the galaxy, the billions of worlds, the countless species, each with their own stories, their own dreams, their own fears. The entity offered to erase all of that, to weave them into a single, perfect harmony. But perfection was a cage. Perfection was the end of growth. Her finger moved, the trigger clicked, the bullet fired. It was not a conventional round. The weapon was a modified pulse rifle, calibrated to emit a focused burst of electromagnetic energy designed to disrupt the cube's resonance. She had built it herself, in the hours after the whisper first entered the nebula, knowing that someday she might need to destroy the very thing that had brought them here. The pulse struck the crystal. For a single, eternal moment, nothing happened. The cube hung in the air, the pulse's energy crackling around it, a web of blue lightning that wrapped around the faceted surface. The gas in the cabin recoiled, retreating from the shockwave. The ship's hull vibrated, a low hum that rose in pitch until it became a scream. Then the crystal shattered. The fragments exploded outward, each one a shard of light that cut through the gas, through the hull, through the nebula itself. The ship lurched, throwing Ilara against the console. The cube's core, the tiny spark, hung suspended for a heartbeat, then flared into a blinding white light that consumed everything. She closed her eyes, but the light penetrated her lids, her skull, her mind. She felt herself being pulled apart, every cell in her body stretching, tearing, reforming. She heard Kaz screaming, Ren laughing, the entity's voice rising into a shriek of fury and despair. And then silence. Absolute, total silence. She opened her eyes. The cabin was intact. The lights were on, steady, normal. The nebula was gone, the gas was gone. The hull was sealed, the cracks sealed as if they had never existed. The console hummed with familiar systems, diagnostics scrolling across the screen. The Whisper was flying, not drifting, not caught in a gravitational eddy, but flying. Stars streamed past the viewport, clean and clear. Alara looked down at her hands. They were clean, the cuts and burns healed. She flexed her fingers and they responded without pain. She touched her face, her chest, her arms. She was whole. "Kaz," she called out. "Kaz, are you there?" A groan from behind the console. Kaz pulled himself to his feet, his face bruised, his eyes confused. What happened? Where is it?" She shook her head. "I don't know. I fired and then nothing." They searched the ship. Ren was gone. His body was not in the cabin, not in the corridor, not in the storage bay. His belongings were still there, his data pad, his jacket, but of Ren himself there was no trace. The cube was gone as well, the fragments nowhere to be found. The ship's logs showed a gap of 3 hours, 3 hours of static, of nothing, of empty space. But the nebula was gone. The Whisper was free. Alara sat in the pilot's seat, staring at the stars. She felt hollow, emptied, as if something had been taken from her. And yet she also felt a strange peace, a quiet that had not been there before. Kaz stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "We did it. We survived." She nodded, but she did not speak, because in the quiet of her mind she heard a whisper, not a voice, but a resonance, a faint echo of the entity's presence. It was not gone. It was not destroyed. It had simply changed. And somewhere deep in the galaxy, a trillion light-years away, a single crystal shard tumbled through the void, carrying a seed that would one day find new soil. The nebula was not a place. It was a beginning, and the galaxy would not forget. The stars outside the viewport were a cold, indifferent carpet of light, each pinprick a reminder of how vast the void truly was. The Whisper glided through it with a smoothness that felt almost surreal after the violent convulsions of the nebula, as if the ship herself had exhaled a long-held breath and settled into a quiet cruise. Yet beneath the veneer of normalcy, a low hum thrummed through the bulkheads, a frequency just below the threshold of hearing, a vibration that seemed to resonate in the marrow of their bones. Alara's fingers lingered on the cool alloy of the pilot's chair, feeling the faint tremor travel up her arm. She glanced at Kaz, who was still massaging the bruise blooming across his left temple. His eyes, usually sharp and pragmatic, darted to the console every few seconds, as though expecting the diagnostics to betray some hidden flaw. 3 hours, he muttered, voice hoarse from the scream that had torn from his throat moments before the light. 3 hours of nothing, not even sensor ghosts, just static. Alara nodded, her mind replaying the blinding flare, the sensation of being pulled apart atom by atom, then snapping back together whole. The memory was a scar that refused to fade, a phantom pain that lingered despite the absence of any physical wound. She pressed her palm flat against the console, feeling the familiar rise and fall of power levels, the soft click of relays engaging as the ship's autonomic systems performed their endless self-checks. "Everything's nominal," she said, more to hear her own voice than to reassure him. "Power, life support, navigation, all within parameters. Even the hull integrity reads at 100%. Kaz frowned, tapping a finger against the edge of the display. "Except for the gap. And Ren." They had searched the ship twice already, once in the immediate aftermath, when adrenaline still coursed through their veins, and again after the lights had steadied and the nebula had vanished from the viewports. Each sweep yielded the same result. Ren's personal effects remained exactly where he had left them, his data pad propped against the bunk, his jacket folded neatly over the chair, a half-eaten nutrient bar still wrapped in its silvery foil on the galley counter. But Ren himself was nowhere. No blood, no signs of struggle, no footprints in the dust that had settled on the deck plates during their frantic escape. Alara moved to the storage bay, the hiss of the door sliding open, sounding unnaturally loud in the otherwise silent corridor. She ran her gloved hand along the rows of sealed containers, feeling for any irregularity, a shift in weight, a temperature anomaly, a faint electromagnetic signature. Nothing. The bay was as orderly as it had been before they entered the nebula, save for a single, almost imperceptible discrepancy. The seal on Container 7 was slightly ajar. The locking mechanism retracted just enough to allow a sliver of darkness to seep out. She knelt, peering inside. The container held spare parts, hydrofluid couplings, spare power cells, a spool of fiber optic cable. Nothing out of place. Yet as she stared, a faint shimmer seemed to dance on the surface of the fluid inside one of the coupling housings, like heat haze over a desert road, though the ambient temperature remained a steady 22 degrees C. "Did you see that?" she whispered, more to herself than to Kaz. He appeared at her side, his expression a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "See what?" she pointed. "There, inside the coupling, it's moving." Kaz leaned in, squinting. For a heartbeat, the shimmer dissolved into nothing, then reappeared, slower this time, as if something were breathing beneath the metal. He reached out, his glove hovering just above the surface, and felt a subtle pushback, a resistance that was not mechanical but almost organic. "It's not a leak," he said slowly. "It's reacting." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. The entity they had faced, whatever it had not been destroyed. It had been transformed. And now it seemed to be leaking into the very fabric of the ship, seeping into the systems they trusted implicitly. She straightened, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Run a full-spectrum scan. Look for anything anomalous, any frequencies outside the normal M-band, any gravitic fluctuations, any quantum entanglement signatures." Kaz moved to the science station, his fingers flying over the holographic interface. The display blossomed with waveforms, spectrograms, and streams of data. After a few tense minutes, he frowned. "We've got something," he said, voice low. A narrowband signal pulsing at 7.3 terahertz, right in the infrared, but modulated in a pattern that doesn't match any known natural phenomenon. It's rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Alara leaned over his shoulder, watching the waveform rise and fall in a slow, deliberate cadence. Each pulse lasted 1.2 seconds, followed by a silence of 0.8 seconds, then repeated. The pattern was eerily familiar, though she could not place it. "It's a beacon," she murmured, "but not one we put out." Kaz flicked a switch, routing the signal through the ship's external array. The whisper's antennae, usually dormant unless actively transmitting, hummed to life, their surfaces vibrating faintly as they attempted to lock onto the source. "Origin point," Alara prompted. The nav display flickered, then settled on a set of coordinates that made her blood run cold. A point deep within the Perseus arm, roughly 1.2 light-years from their current position, but offset, so far off the plotted course that it lay outside any known stellar cartography. The coordinates were not a star system, not a nebula, not even a dark cloud of interstellar dust. They pointed to a location in seemingly empty space, yet the signal's strength suggested a source of considerable power. "Someone, or something, is broadcasting from there," Kaz said, his voice tinged with both awe and dread. "And it's been doing it for however long that 3-hour gap lasted." Alara's thoughts raced. The 3-hour interval in the logs, static, empty, could have been a period of time dilation, a pocket where the normal flow of time had been altered. Or perhaps it had been a period of non-existence, a moment when the ship, its crew, and the nebula itself had been unmade, then remade. The entity had not merely vanished. It had reconfigured reality around them, erasing its own presence while leaving a trace. She felt a prickle at the base of her skull, a sensation she had first noticed when the cube's light had engulfed her, a faint resonance, like the echo of a bell struck far away. Now it returned stronger, a whisper that was not a voice but a pressure against her thoughts. "Do you hear it?" she asked Kaz, though she knew he would not perceive it as she did. He shook his head, brow furrowed. "Hear what? The comms? No, just the signal." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the resonance wash over her. It was not language, but a pattern, an impression of intent, of hunger, of waiting. It felt less like communication and more like a probe, a feeler extending into their consciousness to gauge their reaction. When she opened her eyes, the console displayed a new entry in the ship's log, timestamped just after the 3-hour gap. "Unknown anomaly detected source. Coordinates 7.4's 142.3's signature. Non-terrestrial, quantum entangled. The log entry was in a font she did not recognize, the characters subtly shifting when she stared too long, as if the letters themselves were composed of flickering light. "Kaz," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "the log just wrote itself." He stared at the screen, then at her. "We didn't input that." "No," she agreed. "Something did." A sudden, sharp clang echoed from the aft section, a sound like a tool striking a bulkhead, followed by a low, resonant moan that seemed to vibrate through the deck plates. Both of them froze, eyes darting toward the source. The whisper's interior lighting flickered, plunging the corridor into a brief strobe of red emergency light before returning to normal. In that instant, a shadow, no thicker than a wisp of smoke, slipped across the floor near the engineering hatch, moving with a fluidity that defied the ship's artificial gravity. It was there for a fraction of a second, then gone, leaving behind a faint scent of ozone and burnt copper. Alara's hand flew to the sidearm strapped to her thigh, though she knew conventional weapons would be useless against whatever had just manifested. Kaz, meanwhile, had already slammed his palm onto the emergency seal control, the heavy bulkhead doors beginning to grind shut with a hiss of pressurized air. "Seal it," she commanded, though the doors were already moving. The bulkhead shuddered, sealing the engineering section off from the rest of the ship. The moan faded, replaced by the steady thrum of the Whisper's engines, a sound that now felt less like propulsion and more like a heartbeat, syncing with the mysterious signal pulsing from deep space. They stood in the dim glow of the corridor, breath shallow, ears ringing with the after-echo of the unknown contact. Alara's mind raced through possibilities, a residual effect of the entity's alteration of spacetime, a fragment of its consciousness left behind like a psychic imprint, or perhaps something else entirely, an ancient, dormant intelligence that had been awakened by the cube's detonation and was now using the Whisper as a conduit. "Whatever it is," she said, voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins, "it wants us to notice it. It's leaving breadcrumbs." Kaz glanced at the blinking red light on the bulkhead panel, indicating the seal was holding. "Or it's testing us. Seeing if we'll follow." A soft chime sounded from the console, a notification that the ship's navigational computer had finished recalculating their course based on the latest sensor inputs. The display showed a new vector, a slight deviation from their original trajectory that pointed directly toward the coordinates of the signal. Alara felt a cold sweat prickle her forehead. The nav computer had never autonomously altered a course without explicit crew input unless a critical hazard was detected. Yet there was no hazard warning flashing. The only anomaly was the signal itself. "Did the computer just reroute us?" she asked, half hopeful, half terrified. Kaz shook his head, his expression grim. "No, I didn't touch the controls. The computer, it seems to have taken initiative." She stepped closer to the holographic star map, watching as the projected line of their course bent toward the dark point in space. The further they followed it, the more the surrounding starfield seemed to thin, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. A sudden, sharp pain lanced through Ilara's temple, like a needle of ice piercing her skull. She gasped, clutching her head, and in that instant a flood of images assaulted her mind, not memories but sensations. The taste of metallic dust on her tongue, the sight of a vast, crystalline lattice stretching across light years, the feeling of being observed by countless, faceless eyes that existed outside of time. She stumbled backward, catching herself on the bulkhead, her vision swimming. When the vertigo subsided, she found herself staring at her own reflection in the polished metal of the door, a reflection that was not quite her own. Her eyes, for a split second, glowed with an inner luminescence, a pale violet light that pulsed in time with the signal's heartbeat. She jerked away, heart pounding. "Kaz, did you see that?" He was already moving toward her, concern etched into his features. "See what? You look pale." I think it's trying to speak through me," she whispered, voice trembling. "It's using my mind as a conduit." Before he could respond, the ship's internal PA system crackled to life, though no one had activated it. A voice soft, genderless, layered with harmonics that seemed to resonate from multiple directions at once, filled the corridor. You have survived the unmaking. The seed is sown. The whisper carries the promise. The words were not spoken in any language Alara recognized, yet she understood them perfectly, as if they were implanted directly into her thought processes. The voice continued, each syllable echoing with a peculiar reverb that made the walls seem to breathe. The nebula was a womb. Now the child awakens. Seek the crystal heart. Trust neither sight nor sound. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence that felt heavier than any noise. The corridor lights flickered once more, then steadied at a dimmer level, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to crawl along the bulkheads like living things. Alara lowered her hands, her breathing ragged. She looked at Kaz, whose face was a mask of stark disbelief turning into hardened resolve. "We need to get to those coordinates," she said, voice low but firm. "Whatever is out there, it knows we're here. It's guiding us." Kaz nodded, his jaw clenched. "And we need to find out what happened to Ren. If the entity can take a person, it can take anything." They moved back toward the bridge, each step echoing in the now oppressive silence of the ship. The Whisper's hull seemed to sigh under their weight, as if aware of the gravity of their decision. As they entered the bridge, the main viewer displayed the starfield ahead, the tiny point of light that marked their destination, a speck so faint it was almost lost amidst the background glow of distant galaxies. Alara slipped into the pilot's seat, her hands hovering over the controls. She felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle upon her shoulders, but now it was threaded with something else, a sense of inevitability, as if the ship herself were pulling them toward a destiny written in the fabric of spacetime. She engaged the thrusters, and the Whisper surged forward, the stars outside elongating into streaks as they accelerated toward the mysterious coordinates. The signal's pulse grew stronger in their ears, a steady thrumming that matched the rhythm of her own heartbeat. In the rear of the ship, unseen by the crew, a faint glow began to emanate from the sealed engineering bulkhead, a soft, cerulean light that seeped through the minuscule crack in the seal, tracing intricate patterns on the deck plates like veins of light. The patterns shifted, forming symbols that resembled the alien script that had flashed in the log entry, a language of light and shadow, of creation and dissolution. And somewhere deep within the crystalline lattice of the void beyond known space, a single shard, no larger than a fingernail, vibrated in resonance with the Whisper's approach, its facets catching the light of a billion distant stars and throwing it back in a kaleidoscope of colors that no human eye had ever witnessed. The Whisper pressed on, the nebula's memory fading behind them like a dream, while ahead lay a promise and a peril older than any star, waiting to be claimed. The tension coiled tighter with each passing second, a silent countdown to the moment when the galaxy's darkest secret would finally reveal itself to those daring enough to seek it. The Whisper shuddered as the last of the nebular dust slipped past its scarred hull, the faint cerulean glow from the engineering bulkhead throbbing like a wounded heart. Alara's fingers hovered over the throttle, feeling the subtle vibrations travel up through the seat and into her bones, a rhythm that matched the pulse she now heard not just in her ears, but in the very marrow of her skeleton. Kaz stood behind her, his shoulders rigid, eyes fixed on the viewer where the speck of light had swollen into a blurred disk, its edges frayed by some unseen curvature of space. 30 seconds to intercept, Alara whispered, voice raw from the adrenaline that had been coursing through her since the first whisper of the signal. Kaz, keep an eye on the power grid. If the bulkhead seal fails, Kaz's jaw tightened. I'm on it. The auxiliary couplings are holding, but the flux is spiking. If we draw too much, we could fry the main conduit. A low, almost subsonic hum began to emanate from the walls themselves, a vibration that seemed to sync with the alien script now visible in the crack of the bulkhead. Lines of light that shifted like living glyphs, pulsing in time with the thrum Alara felt in her chest. The symbols were not static. They rearranged themselves, forming patterns that resembled constellations she had never seen, yet felt oddly familiar, as if her mind were reaching back to a memory buried before birth. She swallowed, trying to steady her breath. Ren, if you're out there, hold on. The name felt like a prayer, a plea to whatever intelligence had reached out across the void. The whisper's thrusters flared, a blue-white plume spitting out behind them as the ship surged forward. The stars outside elongated into streaks, then smeared into a tunnel of light that seemed to swallow the horizon. For a moment the cockpit was filled with nothing but the roar of the engines and the frantic beating of Alara's heart. Then, as if the universe itself had inhaled, the noise dropped away, leaving an eerie silence that pressed against the hull like a physical weight. The viewer cleared. What lay ahead was not a planet, nor a moon, nor any known celestial body. It was a vast, irregular structure suspended in the black, an amalgamation of metal and crystal, stretching for kilometers, its surface a mosaic of dark alloy veined with luminous filaments that pulsed with the same cerulean light seeping from the Whisper's engineering bulkhead. The shape was impossible to categorize, part skeletal framework, part organic lattice, as if a gargantuan organism had been forged in the crucible of a dying star and then left to drift, forgotten. Alara's throat went dry. Kaz, do you see that? Kaz leaned forward, his visor reflecting the strange glow. It's a construct, not natural. The scale, it's bigger than any shipyard we've ever built. And those filaments, they're emitting the same frequency as the signal. A sudden jolt threw them sideways as the Whisper's hull resonated with an external force. Alarms screamed, red lights flashing across the console. The engineering bulkhead's crack widened, and the cerulean light spilled onto the deck in a widening pool, illuminating the alien script in stark relief. The symbols now formed a coherent phrase, though its meaning eluded them, a series of repeating triplets that seemed to pulse outward like a heartbeat. Structural integrity dropping to 78%, Kaz barked, his hands flying over the emergency controls. Seal failure imminent. If we don't reroute power to the bulkhead, we'll lose atmosphere in the engineering bay. Alara's mind raced. The signal had been guiding them, but now it felt like a lure, a beacon drawing them into a trap. Yet the pull was undeniable, as if some ancient intelligence had woven a thread of gravity through space-time, tugging at the Whisper's very frame. Divert auxiliary power to the bulkhead seal, she ordered, voice steady despite the roar of alarms. Kaz, manually engage the magnetic clamps on the hull. We need to hold the ship together long enough to get a reading on that thing. Kaz nodded, his fingers dancing across the panel. The Whisper shuddered again as the auxiliary conduits strained, the ship's frame groaning under the stress. Outside, the alien construct loomed larger, its intricate lattice catching the distant starlight and throwing it back in a kaleidoscope of colors that defied human perception, shades that seemed to exist beyond the visible spectrum, making Alara's eyes water and her head throb with a strange, almost nostalgic ache. As the Whisper drew nearer, the structure's surface began to shift. Panels slid open like the petals of a cosmic flower, revealing chambers within that glowed with an inner light. From the depths of those chambers, tendrils of pure energy unfurled, reaching out like fingers of static, brushing the hull with a sensation that was both cold and scorching. A sudden sharp pain lanced through Alara's temple, a flash of images not her own, a sky of violet fire, beings of light and shadow weaving through a cathedral of crystal, a voice that was neither sound nor thought but a pure concept resonating in the marrow of her being. We are the Watchers. We have waited. The key approaches. She gasped, clutching her head. Kaz, did you feel that? He stared at her, eyes wide. I saw something. A presence. It's not just a signal, it's communicating directly. The Whisper's hull shuddered again as a wave of energy struck it, a pulse that rippled through the metal like a stone dropped in a pond. The ship's inertial dampeners flared, trying to compensate, but the force was unlike anything they had encountered. It seemed to alter the very flow of time around them, causing the stars outside to stutter, to flicker as if caught in a strobe. Time dilation, Alara shouted, realizing the implication. We're slipping out of sync with the rest of the galaxy. If we don't break free now, we could be trapped here, for centuries, maybe forever. Kaz slammed his palm onto the emergency override, diverting all non-essential power to the thrusters. We need to punch through that field. The Whisper's engine screamed, a sound that tore through the silence of the void like a banshee's wail. The ship lurched forward, pushing against the invisible barrier that clung to its hull like a viscous membrane. The alien construct's filaments flared brighter, reacting to the thrust as if recognizing a challenge. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a deafening crack that resonated through both ship and soul, the Whisper broke free. The field snapped like a taut thread, releasing a shockwave that sent ripples of energy racing outward, disturbing the nebular dust and causing the distant stars to flare in sudden, brilliant bursts. The viewer cleared once more, revealing the interior of the alien structure now fully exposed. It was a vast cavernous chamber, its walls lined with towering spires of crystal that sang with a low, harmonic resonance. In the center floated a sphere of pure, condensed light, no larger than a wrecking ball, yet radiating an intensity that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Around it, tendrils of energy danced, forming intricate patterns that mirrored the alien script on the Whisper's bulkhead. Alara's breath caught. That's the core, the source of the signal. Kaz's voice was barely a whisper. And it's reacting to us. As they watched, the sphere pulsed, and a beam of light lanced out, striking the Whisper's nose with pinpoint accuracy. The impact was not destructive. Instead, it felt like an infusion, a transfer of something vital. The ship's systems flickered, then stabilized at a level far beyond normal operating parameters. Readouts showed power levels spiking, not draining. The alien script on the bulkhead glowed brighter, the symbols now aligning perfectly with the patterns emanating from the sphere. A sudden, overwhelming sensation flooded Alara's mind. Not fear, not awe, but a profound understanding, as if a veil had been lifted. She saw the construction of the galaxy not as random chance, but as a deliberate lattice, a network of nodes and conduits designed to channel something far older than stars. The sphere was a nexus, a hub where the fabric of reality could be probed, where secrets of creation and dissolution were stored. And then a voice, still not sound but a direct impression, filled her consciousness. You have come far, children of dust. The Whisper carries the mark of the first. The seal you bear is a key. The nebula remembers, the dark secret stirs. Alara gasped, feeling tears sting her eyes. The first, the original architects. The ones who seeded the galaxy with life. Kaz, his face pale, whispered, and the dark secret, what is it? The sphere's light intensified, and from its depths a shape began to coalesce. A silhouette, humanoid yet shifting, composed of the same crystalline filaments that made up the structure. It hovered, observing them with eyes that were voids filled with starfields. We are the architects, the presence intoned, and we have watched the rise and fall of civilizations. The secret you seek is not a weapon, nor a treasure. It is the potential to unmake, to remake. The balance hangs on a thread. You have been drawn here because the Whisper's damage has awakened a resonance. The seal on your ship is a fragment of the primer, the original code that bound reality. If it falls into the wrong hands, or if it is misused, the galaxy could unravel. A cold dread settled in Alara's gut. The Whisper's damage, the strange glow, the resonance, it had all been a test, a call to those who carried the shard of the primer. And now they stood at the precipice of knowledge that could either save or doom everything. Kaz clenched his fists. We can't let that happen. We have to secure it. Or destroy it if necessary. The architect's form flickered. You are not the first to arrive. Others have come seeking power. They were consumed. The Whisper is damaged, but its heart beats true. Choose wisely. The sphere pulsed again, and a wave of energy washed over the Whisper, filling the cockpit with a blinding white light. When it receded, the engineering bulkhead seal had reformed, stronger than before, the alien script now etched permanently into the metal, a living tattoo of light. Alara looked at her hands, feeling the faint tremor of the primer's resonance thrumming through her fingertips. She understood now why the Whisper had been drawn to this place. It was not merely a scout ship. It was a vessel meant to carry the key, to guard it, to decide its fate. Kaz, she said, voice low but firm, we need to get that core out of here. If we can isolate it, we can study it, protect it, or if it's too dangerous, we can seal it away forever. Kaz nodded, his resolve hardening. But we have to move fast. The architects won't let us leave with it easily. A low rumble began to emanate from the structure itself, as if the very fabric of the construct was awakening. The crystalline spires shifted, aligning themselves into a formation that resembled a gigantic, interlocking gear system. The sphere's light flared, casting shifting shadows that danced like specters across the walls. The Whisper's thrusters groaned as they fought against an invisible tide, the ship's hull vibrating with the effort to break free from the gravitational and temporal pull of the Nexus. Alarms blared once more, but this time they were layered with a deeper, harmonic tone, the song of the architects themselves. Alara gripped the controls tighter, feeling the ship respond to her as if it were an extension of her own body. Hold on, Kaz. We're going to punch through. She pushed the throttles forward, and the Whisper surged, a spear of metal and determination aimed at the heart of the alien construct. The sphere emitted a final, blinding flash, and for a moment everything, light, sound, time, seemed to converge into a single point of pure potential. Then, with a sound like the cracking of a world, the Whisper broke through the Nexus's field. The construct's spires shuddered, the crystalline lattice fracturing along lines of pure energy, sending shards of light scattering like rain. The sphere dimmed, its pulse slowing to a faint throb as the connection severed. The viewer filled with the starfield again, but the sky was altered. Where the nebula had once been a veil of pastel clouds, now a rift yawned, a wound in the fabric of space, glowing with the same cerulean light that had marked their journey. Through it, whispers of distant galaxies could be heard, a chorus of voices speaking in tongues older than time. Alara leaned back in her seat, breath ragged, heart hammering. The Whisper's hull bore fresh scars, blackened marks where the energy had licked its surface. But the ship held together, its systems humming with a newfound stability, the alien script on the bulkhead now a steady, soft glow that pulsed in time with her own pulse. Kaz slumped into his chair, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. We made it. Alara turned to him, her eyes reflecting the distant stars and the faint, lingering glow of the seal. We've seen the galaxy's darkest secret, and we've carried a piece of the primer back with us. Outside, the rift began to collapse, the edges pulling inward as spacetime sought to heal itself. The cerulean light faded, leaving behind only the ordinary glitter of distant suns. But as the Whisper turned away from the dying Nexus, a final thought slipped into Alara's mind, soft as a sigh yet heavy as a world. The secret is not gone, it merely waits, and the galaxy will remember. She stared at the viewscreen, the stars streaming past as the ship eased into sublight, the weight of what they had witnessed settling like a mantle over her shoulders. The journey ahead would be long, the dangers unknown, but one thing was certain. They were no longer just a damaged scout ship adrift in the void. They were the keepers of a fire that could either illuminate the cosmos or consume it whole. The Whisper slipped into the dark, its engines a quiet promise against the endless night, and the galaxy held its breath, waiting to see what would become of the key they now carried. Chapter 8. The echoes within the Whisper drifted through the aftermath of the Nexus collapse, its hull trembling as if the ship itself remembered the violence it had endured. The nebula around them was no longer a veil of beauty. It was a battlefield scarred by forces beyond comprehension. The cerulean wound in spacetime had sealed, but its residue lingered, a faint shimmer that clung to the edges of perception like a ghost refusing to depart. Alara sat rigid in the command chair, her fingers clenched around the armrests. Every breath felt heavy, as though the nebula itself pressed against her lungs. Kaz was silent beside her, his eyes fixed on the console, but his mind was elsewhere. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his hands hovered over the controls without moving. They had survived, yes, but survival was not victory. Not here. Not now. The alien script on the bulkhead pulsed steadily, its rhythm unnervingly synchronized with Alara's heartbeat. She tried to ignore it, but the glow seemed to seep into her thoughts, whispering fragments of meaning she could not fully grasp. The secret is not gone, it merely waits. The words echoed again, not from her own mind this time, but from the ship itself. The whisper was speaking, or perhaps remembering. Kaz broke the silence. We shouldn't linger here. Whatever that rift was, it left echoes. His voice was low, almost reverent, as though he feared waking something slumbering in the dark. Alara nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the viewport. The stars beyond seemed wrong, slightly shifted, slightly dimmed, as though reality itself had been bent by their passage. Echoes, she repeated, or warnings. The ship's sensors flickered, static crawling across the displays. A faint signal pulsed in the background, irregular, distorted. It was not a distress call, not a transmission in any known frequency. It was a heartbeat. Slow, deliberate, resonating through the nebula like the pulse of a colossal organism. The whisper system strained to interpret it, but every attempt ended in failure. The signal was not meant for machines. It was meant for minds. Kaz leaned forward, his exhaustion momentarily forgot. It's following us. Alara's throat tightened. Not following, watching. The nebula's clouds shifted, curling into shapes that defied geometry. For an instant, Alara thought she saw eyes, vast, luminous, staring from the mist. Then they dissolved, leaving only the endless swirl of gas and dust. But the feeling remained. They were not alone. The nebula itself was aware, and it remembered what had been torn from its heart. The whisper shuddered. Lights dimmed, then flared. The alien script on the bulkhead rearranged itself, symbols twisting into new forms. Alara felt the change inside her skull, as though the ship had reached into her thoughts and rewritten them. She gasped, clutching her head, and in that moment she saw fleeting, fragmented visions of worlds burning, of civilizations collapsing into silence, of a secret carried across eons like a curse. The primer was not knowledge. It was contagion. Kaz grabbed her arm. Alara, stay with me. She blinked, the visions fading, but the terror remained. Inside us, she whispered. The ship of the secret, it's not just carried, it's alive. The heartbeat signal grew louder, resonating through the hull. The nebula's clouds thickened, closing in until the stars were swallowed by darkness. The whisper's engines strained, but the void around them resisted, as though the ship were caught in the grip of something vast and unseen. The nebula was not a place. It was a prison, and they were the intruders. Kaz slammed his fist against the console. We need to break free. Alara shook her head. No, if we fight it, we'll be crushed. This isn't a storm, it's a mind. We have to listen. The alien script pulsed faster, symbols cascading across the bulkhead in a torrent of meaning. Alara's breath caught as she realized what it was, a question. The nebula was asking, demanding, why do you carry the fire? Her voice trembled as she answered, though she did not know if the nebula could hear. Because it was given to us, because we survived. The heartbeat paused. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Then slowly, the nebula's grip loosened. The clouds parted, revealing a corridor of light, a path carved through the darkness. The whisper drifted forward, guided not by its engines but by the will of something greater. Kaz exhaled, his shoulders sagging. It let us go. Alara's eyes narrowed. No, it showed us the way, and that means it expects us to follow. The corridor stretched ahead, deeper into the nebula, toward a destination unseen. The alien script glowed brighter, its rhythm now steady, insistent. The whisper was no longer a damaged scout ship. It was a vessel chosen, marked, burdened with a secret that could ignite or annihilate the galaxy. And the nebula, alive, ancient, watchful, was their judge. Alara closed her eyes, the weight of inevitability pressing down on her. The journey was no longer theirs to choose. The fire they carried had found its path, and the galaxy's darkest secret was leading them deeper into the abyss. The whisper moved forward, engines silent, as the nebula swallowed them whole. And somewhere in the endless dark, a voice waited, patient and eternal, ready to speak the truth that no civilization had ever survived to tell. Chapter 9. The corridor of echoes, the whisper drifted deeper into the carved passage of light, its hull trembling as though the ship itself feared what lay ahead. The nebula's walls pulsed faintly, like veins carrying some vast, alien lifeblood. Every flicker of illumination seemed to breathe, and every shadow seemed to watch. Kaz kept his hands tight on the controls, though the engines were silent, powerless. He hated the feeling being carried, not piloting. It was as if they were prey ushered into the predator's den. Alara stood rigid, her eyes locked on the glowing script that continued to cascade across the bulkhead. The symbols had changed. They were no longer questions, they were instructions, a sequence, a ritual. She whispered the translation as it formed in her mind: prepare the vessel, prepare the fire, prepare the end. Kaz's jaw clenched. End? What kind of end? Her voice was hollow. Not destruction, transformation. It wants us to become something else. The heartbeat signal returned, louder now, resonating through their bones. It was no longer a rhythm, it was a countdown. Each pulse carried weight, a pressure that bent the air, made the walls groan. The Whisper's lights flickered, systems straining against an invisible force. Kaz slammed the console again, but the ship ignored him. It was no longer theirs to command. Then came the sound, a low, guttural vibration like a chorus of voices buried beneath the nebula's skin. It rose and fell in waves, not words but intent. Alara staggered back, clutching her head. It's speaking not to us, to itself, to the fire. Kaz turned sharply. The fire? You mean the primer? She nodded, trembling. It's not just inside us, it's inside the ship. It's been waiting for this moment. The corridor widened abruptly, opening into a vast chamber of light suspended in the void. The Whisper floated at its center, dwarfed by colossal structures that emerged from the nebula's walls, arches of living matter, lattices of energy, spirals of alien design. They were not built, they were grown, and they pulsed in time with the heartbeat. Kaz's breath caught. What is this place? Alara's voice was barely audible. A crucible. The alien script flared, covering every surface of the chamber. The symbols twisted, rearranged, forming a single phrase that burned into their minds. The fire must be tested. Suddenly, the Whisper shuddered. Panels tore open, conduits split, and streams of light poured from the ship's core. The primer was awakening. Kaz grabbed Alara, pulling her back as the deck beneath them rippled like liquid. The ship was unraveling, reshaping itself under the nebula's command. Alara's eyes widened in horror. It's rewriting the Whisper. It's rewriting us. The chamber's structures bent inward, focusing on the ship. Beams of energy lanced out, piercing the hull, threading through the corridors like needles through flesh. Kaz screamed as one passed through him, not burning, not cutting, but probing. It searched, it judged. He felt his memories laid bare, his fears dissected, his soul weighed against something vast and merciless. Alara collapsed, convulsing as the beams wrapped around her. She saw visions, worlds consumed by fire, civilizations erased, stars collapsing into silence. She saw the primer carried across eons, infecting species, twisting them into vessels, then discarding them when they failed the test. None had survived. None had been worthy, until now. The heartbeat grew deafening, each pulse shaking the chamber. The nebula's voice thundered inside their minds. Why do you carry the fire? Why do you endure? Alara forced herself to speak, her voice breaking. Because we have no choice. Because survival is not enough, we endure to change. The chamber fell silent, the beams withdrew. The Whisper hung motionless, its hull scarred but intact. The alien script dimmed, leaving only a single symbol glowing faintly on the bulkhead, a mark etched into the ship's very being. It was not a word, it was a verdict. Kaz staggered to his feet, his body trembling. What did it decide? Alara stared at the mark, her face pale. It judged us, not unworthy, but not ready. The nebula's walls shifted, the corridor of light collapsing behind them. Ahead, a new path opened, narrower, darker, lined with structures that pulsed like beating hearts. The Whisper drifted forward, compelled by forces beyond their control. Kaz's voice was hoarse. Where is it taking us? Alara's answer was a whisper, heavy with dread. To the place where the fire was born. The chamber faded into shadow, the heartbeat slowing, steady, patient. The nebula had not released them. It had only begun the trial. And somewhere ahead, in the abyss beyond the corridor, the galaxy's darkest secret waited, alive, eternal, and ready to reveal the truth that no civilization had ever survived to hear. Chapter 10. The whisper slipped through the narrowing throat of the nebula like a wounded animal forced into a burrow, its scarred hull scraping against tendrils of ionized plasma that hissed and sputtered wherever they made contact. Inside, the air tasted metallic, thick with the faint ozone tang of discharged energy, and every breath Kaz drew felt as if he were inhaling the sigh of a dying star. Ilara clung to the bulkhead beside him, her fingers white-knuckled on the cold alloy, eyes darting between the pulsing walls and the flickering readouts that danced across her visor like desperate fireflies. The corridor ahead was no longer a simple passage. It had become a living artery. Vessels of luminescent fluid, resembling both blood and molten glass, snaked along the bulkheads, throbbing in rhythm with the nebula's slow, omnipresent heartbeat. Each pulse sent a shudder through the ship, causing the deck plates to flex minutely, as though the vessel itself were breathing. The alien script that had once covered the interior now lay dormant, its glyphs faded to ash, save for the single verdict symbol that still glowed faintly on the bulkhead behind them, a silent judge watching their every move. Kaz's mind raced, a tumult of fragmented memories and fresh terror. The probe that had speared through him earlier had not left a physical wound, but it had left something else, a lingering sensation of being unraveled at the quantum level, as if his very particles had been momentarily teased apart and then hastily stitched back together. He could still feel the echo of that intrusion, a low hum resonating in his marrow, a reminder that the nebula was not merely observing them. It was learning, testing, perhaps even rewriting the fundamental code of their existence. Ilara, meanwhile, was haunted by the visions the beams had forced upon her. The specter of worlds consumed by fire, civilizations reduced to ash, stars collapsing into silent black holes played behind her eyelids like a looping nightmare. She saw the primer, not as a mere artifact, but as a seed, a parasitic intelligence that had drifted across the gulf of time, latching onto species, bending them to its inscrutable purpose, and discarding them when they failed the nebulous test. The scale of it was staggering. Entire galaxies could have been its feeding grounds, and yet the nebula had remained patient, waiting for a worthy vessel. A sudden, sharp crack reverberated through the hull, pulling Kaz from his reverie. A section of the corridor ahead had constricted violently, the luminous fluid within the walls recoiling like a snake struck. The whisper shuddered, alarms bleeding in a strained, harmonic chorus that seemed to emanate from the ship's own bones. Kaz slammed his palm against the emergency override, his fingers slipping on the slick surface as a spray of conductive mist erupted from a fractured conduit, sizzling as it met the plasma-rich atmosphere. "Seal breach on port side." Ilara shouted, her voice raw but cutting through the din. She lunged toward the breach, pulling a handheld plasma torch from her belt. The torch's blue flame licked the air, melting the edges of the rupture and allowing the ship's internal sealing nanofibers to rush in, weaving a temporary mesh that glowed with a soft, emerald light as it polymerized. "Hold it," Kaz barked, gripping the nearest handhold as the whisper lurched again, this time thrown sideways by a sudden surge of gravitational shear. The nebula itself seemed to be tugging at them, its invisible fingers attempting to pull the ship apart strand by strand. For a heartbeat, the deck tilted alarmingly, and Kaz felt his stomach lurch into his throat as the artificial gravity faltered, leaving them weightless for a disorienting stretch before the ship's inertial dampeners kicked back online with a shuddering groan. Through the viewport, the nebula's interior unfolded in a panorama of awe and terror. Filaments of ionized gas stretched for light years, intertwining like the veins of a colossal organism. Within those filaments, knots of denser matter pulsed, proto-stars in various stages of ignition, their cores flickering with the promise of nascent fire. Somewhere deeper, beyond the veil of swirling colors, lay the heart of the nebula, a region where the primordial forces that had given birth to the first stars still churned, a crucible of creation and destruction intertwined. The whisper was being drawn inexorably toward that heart. The corridor narrowed further, the walls closing in like the jaws of some cosmic predator. The luminous fluid inside the bulkheads grew thicker, its viscosity increasing until it resembled molten amber, slowing the ship's progress to a painful crawl. Each meter gained felt like a victory wrested from an indifferent universe, each second stretching into an eternity as the nebula's scrutiny intensified. Kaz's HUD flashed warnings, radiation levels climbing, micrometeoroid impacts increasing, structural integrity dropping below safe thresholds. Yet the ship's AI, a fragmented lattice of subroutines salvaged from the primer's own code, remained eerily silent, offering no guidance, no reassurance. It seemed the Whisper had become a mere passenger, its own systems overridden by the nebula's will. Why is it doing this? Kaz muttered, more to himself than to Alara, his voice hoarse from the strain of shouting over the alarms. What does it want from us? Alara's eyes were fixed on the shifting patterns of light outside, her mind racing through the fragments of data they had managed to salvage from the Whisper's archives before the primer's awakening. It's not just testing us, she whispered, her breath fogging the inside of her helmet. It's learning. The primer isn't a weapon, it's a catalyst. It seeks to understand what drives a species to persist despite oblivion. The nebula. It's the archive of all those who have tried and failed. And now it's watching to see if we're different. A sudden, deafening roar split the silence, a sound not of metal or plasma, but of pure, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of space-time. The Whisper shuddered as if struck by a colossal gong, and the corridor ahead flared with a blinding white light. For an instant, the nebula's walls became transparent, revealing a vast chamber beyond, a cavernous dome of swirling energies. At its center, a sphere of pure, incandescent plasma that pulsed with a rhythm matching the nebula's heartbeat. The sphere was unlike any star Kaz had ever seen. It was not a ball of gas undergoing fusion. It was a tightly bound vortex of energy, its surface a roiling tapestry of magnetic fields and photon streams that intertwined in impossible geometries. Around it, tendrils of dark matter curled like smoke, and from the sphere's core emanated a low, harmonic tone that resonated directly with the Whisper's hull, vibrating through every bolt and plate. That's the fire's birthplace, Alara breathed, her voice reverent and terrified. The primordial fire. The first ignition. Kaz felt a prickle at the base of his skull, a sensation akin to déjà vu, as if some forgotten part of his consciousness recognized the sight. The nebula's voice, which had been a distant thunder in their minds, now crystallized into a clear, resonant timbre that seemed to speak directly from the sphere itself. "Why do you carry the fire?" the voice asked, each word a wave that washed over them, stripping away pretense. Kaz swallowed, feeling the weight of countless extinct civilizations pressing upon him. "Because we are afraid of dying without meaning," he answered, his voice trembling but steady. "We cling to the fire because it gives us purpose, even if it burns us." The sphere's pulse faltered for a fraction of a second, then surged brighter, as if considering his words. The nebula's walls rippled, the luminous fluid within them spiraling inward toward the sphere, drawing energy from the ship's own power reserves. Lights flickered, systems groaned, and the Whisper's hull began to glow with an inner light, as though the ship itself were becoming a conduit for the primordial fire. Alara stepped forward, her hand outstretched, not to touch the sphere, but to grasp the edge of the viewing port, feeling the vibrations travel up her arm. "We don't want to dominate it," she said, her voice barely audible over the rising hum. "We want to understand, to learn why it chose us, why it let us survive when others fell." A silence fell, heavier than any vacuum. The sphere's light dimmed slightly, then flared again in a pattern that resembled a pulse, short, long, short, like a Morse code signal etched into the fabric of reality. Kaz's HUD flickered, translating the pattern into a sequence of numbers and symbols that resolved into a phrase he could not have anticipated. "Remember." The word hung in the air, a command and a plea combined. Remember what? Remember the cost. Remember the promise. Remember the ones who had come before and been consumed. Before they could ponder further, the nebula's corridor convulsed. The walls began to collapse inward, not in destruction but in a deliberate folding, as if the nebula were sealing off the chamber, preserving the sphere's secret for the next worthy seekers. The whisper was thrust backward, flung along the narrowing passage with a force that slammed Kaz against the bulkhead, knocking the wind from his lungs. Alara was thrown forward, her grip on the port slipping as she scrambled to maintain her footing. Alarms screamed, a cacophony of warning tones that overlapped into a dissonant chord. Structural integrity alerts flashed red across every console, the ship's frame groaning under the stress of the nebula's compressive embrace. Sparks flew from exposed conduits, and the air filled with the smell of burnt insulation and ionized metal. Kaz fought to stay conscious, his vision swimming as the G-forces pressed his chest against the harness. He could feel the ship's plating flex, the alloy groaning like a living thing under strain. In his periphery, he saw Alara's face, determined, terrified, eyes locked on the collapsing corridor as if she could will it to hold. Hold on. He roared, his voice raw, his hands finding purchase on a reinforced girder. He pulled himself upward, using the momentum to brace against the bulkhead, his boots scraping against the deck as he sought to anchor himself. The whisper shuddered one last time, then, as if released from a gargantuan grip, shot forward with a sudden burst of velocity. The nebula's walls flew past in a blur of color and light, the corridor expanding once more into a wider passage. The sphere's radiant glow receded behind them, its pulse fading to a distant throb that resonated through the ship's hull like a dying star's final beat. For a moment, there was only the sound of their own ragged breathing and the faint, persistent hum of the primer, now dormant but still thrumming faintly at the edge of perception. The nebula's walls, no longer actively probing, seemed to sigh, the luminous fluid within them settling into a gentle, rhythmic flow, like the slow circulation of a vast, sleeping beast. Alara slumped against the bulkhead, her helmet fogged with sweat and tears. She removed her glove, pressing her palm against the cool metal, feeling the residual vibrations travel up her arm. "We made it for now," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Kaz, still gripping the girder, lowered himself slowly to the deck, his muscles trembling. He stared at the verdict symbol on the bulkhead behind them, its faint glow unchanged, a silent sentinel. The nebula had not destroyed them, it had merely paused, assessing, waiting. A new dread settled in his chest, colder than the vacuum outside. The trial was not over. The nebula had shown them the birthplace of fire, the source of the primer's power, and had asked them to remember. But what precisely were they meant to remember? The sacrifices of those who had come before, the price of wielding such fire. Or perhaps something far more insidious, a truth so fundamental that knowing it would alter the very nature of consciousness itself. The corridor ahead stretched into darkness, its walls now smooth and unadorned, devoid of the pulsating fluid that had once threatened to crush them. Yet the air felt thinner, charged with a latent potential, as if the nebula itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Kaz pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting. He glanced at Alara, who was already moving toward the forward hatch, her hand hovering over the release mechanism. "We keep going," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Whatever lies ahead, we face it together." Alara nodded, her expression a mask of resolve. She engaged the hatch, and with a soft hiss, the barrier slid open, revealing a passage that yawned like the maw of some ancient leviathan. Beyond, the nebula's depths beckoned, an endless expanse of shadow and light, of silent sentinels and whispering secrets. They stepped forward, the whisper gliding silently into the unknown, its scarred hull a testament to the trials endured and the fire yet to be understood. Behind them, the nebula's heartbeat slowed, a patient, eternal rhythm that seemed to echo one thought: the fire awaits, and so does the truth. The galaxy's darkest secret lay ahead, alive and waiting, and the whisper, its crew bruised, its spirit tested, was hurtling toward it, driven by a curiosity that was both their greatest strength and their most perilous flaw. As they vanished into the nebula's gloom, the faint glow of the verdict symbol on the bulkhead lingered in their minds, a reminder that they had been judged, not as unworthy, but as not yet ready. And somewhere in the abyss beyond, the fire of creation burned, ready to reveal what no civilization had ever survived to hear. Chapter 11. The verdict of silence. The whisper drifted deeper into the nebula, its hull creaking as though the ship itself sensed the weight of what lay ahead. The stars outside had vanished entirely, swallowed by the thickening veil of luminous gas. Only the faint pulse of the nebula's inner currents illuminated the void, casting ghostly shadows across the control deck. Kaz and Alara stood side by side, their eyes fixed on the forward viewport where the darkness seemed to ripple with intent. The silence was unbearable. It wasn't the silence of space, nor the silence of a ship powered down. It was a silence that pressed against their minds, a silence that spoke. Every breath felt stolen, every heartbeat amplified. Kaz's hand hovered over the console, but he dared not touch it. The nebula had stripped them of control before. Now it seemed to demand obedience through stillness. Then, without warning, the verdict symbol reappeared, this time not on the bulkhead but suspended in the air itself, a glowing sigil of judgment. Its shape shifted, fractal patterns folding into themselves, each iteration more complex, more impossible. Alara's breath caught. "It's rewriting itself," she whispered. "As if it's deciding." Kaz's throat tightened. "Deciding what?" The symbol pulsed once and the deck beneath them trembled. A low hum filled the ship, resonating through their bones. The nebula was no longer waiting. It was testing. The whisper systems flickered, lights dimming then flaring back to life. The engines roared without command, propelling them forward into a corridor of light carved through the gas. The nebula had chosen their path. Alara gripped the railing, her knuckles white. "We're not steering anymore, it's taking us somewhere." Kaz forced himself to steady his voice. "Then wherever it's taking us, that's where the truth is." The corridor narrowed, its walls shimmering with translucent figures, shadows of beings long gone. They were not human, nor alien in any recognizable sense. They were impressions, echoes of consciousness etched into the nebula itself. Each figure turned as the whisper passed, their faceless forms radiating sorrow, warning, and something deeper, resignation. Kaz felt their gaze like knives in his mind. He staggered, clutching his head. Their memories, the ones who came before. Alara's voice trembled. And they didn't survive. The ship jolted violently, throwing them against the deck. A fissure of light split the corridor ahead, revealing a vast chamber suspended in the nebula's heart. It was not a natural formation. It was a construct, a cathedral of fire and shadow. Pillars of plasma arched upward, converging into a singular point where a sphere of pure energy hovered, pulsing with unbearable brilliance. The fire of creation, the primer's source. Kaz's breath caught in his throat. This is it. But the sphere was not alone. Around it, countless verdict symbols floated, each one unique, each one alive. They rotated slowly, orbiting the fire like judges encircling a prisoner. The whisper halted at the chamber's edge, held in place by forces beyond comprehension. The silence deepened, and then voices, not spoken, not heard, but felt. A chorus of thought that pierced their minds. "You are not the first. You will not be the last. The fire is eternal. The verdict is silence." Alara's knees buckled and she fell against the console. "It's speaking to us." "Kaz, it's telling us." Kaz's vision blurred. The voices pressed harder, unraveling his thoughts, peeling back the layers of his memory. He saw flashes, the first explorers who had entered the nebula, their ships torn apart, their minds consumed. He saw civilizations rising and falling, each one daring to touch the fire, each one erased from history. And then he saw something worse, the fire itself, not as a gift but as a trap. A lure designed to draw in the curious, the ambitious, the desperate. A secret so dark it had been hidden in plain sight. The nebula was not a birthplace. It was a graveyard. Kaz gasped, clutching his chest. "It's feeding. Every mind that comes here, every soul, it takes them. That's the secret. That's why no one survives." Alara's eyes widened in horror. "And now it wants us." The verdict symbols flared, their light blinding. The whisper's hull groaned, its systems failing one by one. The fire pulsed, sending waves of energy through the chamber. Kaz and Alara clung to each other, their bodies trembling under the weight of the revelation. The nebula was not testing them. It was consuming them, judging them not for worthiness but for usefulness. Their memories, their knowledge, their very consciousness, it wanted everything. Alara's voice broke. Kaz, if we give in, will be erased. Just like the others, Kaz's mind raced. The fire awaited, the verdict loomed, and the galaxy's darkest secret was clear. The nebula was eternal because it devoured eternity. He tightened his grip on Alara's hand, his voice raw but resolute. Then we fight. We don't let it take us. We don't let it win. The chamber shook violently, the fire expanding, the verdict symbols converging. The whisper's hull cracked, alarms blaring. The nebula's silence became a roar, a tidal wave of thought crashing against their minds. Kaz and Alara screamed, their voices lost in the storm. And then everything went white. The verdict was silence, but silence was not the end. It was the threshold. And beyond that threshold, Chapter 12 awaited, the final revelation, the last chance to defy the fire, and the moment when the galaxy's darkest secret would either consume them or be exposed to all. The white light did not blind so much as it unmade. It stripped away the thin veneer of flesh and bone, leaving Kaz and Alara suspended in a lattice of pure thought, each neuron a glowing filament stretched across an infinite, obsidian canvas. For a heartbeat they existed as disembodied awareness, their senses inverted. Sound became color, pressure became taste. The void itself hummed with a low, resonant chord that seemed to vibrate at the frequency of forgotten lullabies. Around them, the nebula's fire was no longer a roaring plasma but a tapestry of shifting sigils, each glyph a fragment of a language older than stars. The verdict symbols, those stark, angular marks that had flared in the chamber, now floated like icy shards, rotating slowly, their edges catching the light of distant pulsars and throwing prismatic shards across the darkness. They were not merely warnings. They were anchors, points where the entity that called itself the fire could latch onto a mind and begin the slow, inexorable extraction of self. Kaz felt the first tug as a thin filament of thought, silver as moonlight on water, slipped from the edge of his consciousness and latched onto the nearest symbol. It was not painful at first, more like the sensation of a thread being pulled gently through fabric, a faint tingling that traced the outline of his memories. He saw, in rapid succession, the face of his mother laughing in a sun-lit kitchen, the smell of ozone after a storm on his homeworld, the weight of his first command badge pressing into his chest as he swore the oath of the scout fleet. Each image flickered, then began to fray at the edges, the colors bleaching to a pallid gray as the filament drew them inward, toward the burning core of the symbol. Alara's experience was a mirror but inverted. Where Kaz's memories were being unspooled, hers were being rewritten. She felt the fire's presence as a cold pressure behind her eyes, a voice that did not speak but imprinted, a series of impressions that settled into her mind like sediment in a still pond. She saw the nebula not as a graveyard but as a womb, a vast, gelatinous matrix where consciousnesses were dissolved and recombined, birthing new patterns of thought that drifted like plankton through the cosmic sea. She sensed an ancient intelligence, vast and patient, coiled within the heart of the fire, its thoughts moving on timescales that made the rise and fall of galaxies seem like the flutter of a moth's wing. A sudden, violent jolt ripped through the lattice. The whisper's fractured hull, still clinging to the edge of the nebula's influence, shuddered as a surge of energy lanced outward from the fire's core. The verdict symbols flared brighter, their light turning from cerulean to a searing white that threatened to overwrite the very fabric of their thoughts. Alarms, though now purely mental, screamed in a cacophony of shattered glass and tearing metal, each note a warning that the threshold they had just crossed was collapsing, that the fire was attempting to seal them within its grasp before they could fully comprehend what lay beyond. Kaz's grip on Alara's hand tightened until his knuckles blanched, the contact a lifeline amid the disintegrating chaos. He could feel her fear, a sharp, icy spike that cut through the fog of extraction, and he clung to it as if it were a physical rope. Alara, he thought, projecting his voice directly into the shared mindscape, we have to reverse the flow. The fire feeds on our thoughts, but it also needs a conduit. If we can overload it, if we can push our own consciousness back into it, maybe we can cause a feedback. Alara's mind, still half lost in the impression of the nebula's womb, flickered with a sudden, startling clarity. "The transmitter," she whispered, though no sound passed between them. "The whisper's array is still partially online. If we can modulate the fire's own emission through the damaged crystal lattice, we might turn its own energy against it, like a serpent biting its tail." The thought sparked a cascade of images. The crystal array, a lattice of rare earth silicates woven through the ship's spine, each facet tuned to resonate at specific frequencies. In the fire's maw, those frequencies were being distorted, turned into the very symbols that judged them. If they could inject a counter-phase signal, a wave of pure, chaotic thought, perhaps they could jam the feedback loop, causing the fire to momentarily lose its grip on the verdict symbols, and consequently on the minds it was consuming. They moved as one thought, their consciousnesses intertwining like twin helices. Kaz reached deep into the reserves of his training, recalling the emergency protocols for overriding a failing quantum core. He visualized the sequence of commands, the precise timing of capacitor discharges, the way to shunt power from the auxiliary reactors into the transmission array despite the ship's battered state. Ilara, meanwhile, focused on the fire's internal rhythm, sensing the pulse of the verdict symbols as a slow, throbbing beat, like a heart made of neutron star matter. She imagined imposing a discordant rhythm upon it, a jagged staccato that would clash with the symbol's harmonic resonance. With a concerted effort of will, they pushed. The lattice of their shared mind became a conduit, channeling raw, unfiltered cognition into the ship's wounded systems. The whisper shuddered, metal groaning as dormant conduits re-energized. Sparks flew from ruptured conduits, not as destructive arcs but as controlled bursts of ionized plasma that licked the air like emerald fireflies. The transmission array, a cracked dish of mirrored alloy, began to hum, its surface rippling with interference patterns as the two minds forced their thoughts through it. The fire reacted instantly. The verdict symbols, which had been steady, began to flicker erratically, their edges fraying as if caught in a magnetic storm. A low, guttural moan rose from the nebula's core, not a sound, but a pressure wave of pure intent that crashed against their mental shields, threatening to shatter them. The fire seemed to sense the intrusion, to recognize that its prey was attempting to turn the tables. Kaz felt a sudden, painful lance of thought pierce his skull, a fragment of the fire's own awareness, ancient and ravenous, probing for weakness. It showed him visions of countless civilizations that had tried the same gambit. Brilliant scientists, desperate poets, war-hardened warriors, all launching their minds into the fire only to be consumed. Their contributions added to the ever-growing chorus that whispered through the nebula's depths. Each attempt had strengthened the fire, each failure fed its hunger. The realization was a cold blade. If they failed, they would not merely die. They would become part of the judgment, another voice in the eternal verdict that declared silence as the ultimate fate. Ilara's mind, meanwhile, was flooded with a contrasting vision, a possibility. She saw the fire not as an indiscriminate devourer, but as a gatekeeper, a sentinel placed eons ago by a forgotten precursor race to contain a primordial entropy that lurked beyond the nebula, a chaos that would unravel spacetime if let loose. The verdict symbols were not merely a test, they were a lock. The fire consumed minds to keep the lock charged, to maintain the barrier. If they could overload the fire and transmit the knowledge of its purpose outward, they could both break the seal and warn the galaxy of the danger that lay beyond, turning the sacrifice into a beacon. The tension between these two truths coiled like a spring inside their shared psyche. Kaz's instinct screamed for self-preservation, to fight the consumption at any cost. Ilara's insight whispered that the only way to truly defy the fire was to give it what it craved, a mind, but to twist that offering into a weapon. A sudden, violent crack split the nebula's veil. The Whisper's hull, strained beyond its limits, gave a mournful groan as a section of the outer plating tore away, exposing the raw, glowing core of the fire directly to the vacuum. A jet of incandescent plasma lanced outward, forming a temporary pillar that connected the ship to the heart of the nebula. In that blazing column, the vertex symbols converged, coalescing into a single, massive glyph that pulsed with a rhythm matching the beating of a dying star. Kaz and Alara found themselves at the nexus of that pillar, their thoughts amplified 1,000-fold by the focusing effect of the plasma conduit. The fire's hunger surged, reaching for them with tendrils of pure cognition that sought to unmake their identities, to peel away memory after memory until only a blank slate remained. Yet in that same instant, the transmission array sang, a high-pitched, keening tone that cut through the plasma like a laser through fog. They poured everything they had into that signal, the terror of imminent annihilation, the love that had blossomed in the cramped corridors of the Whisper, the fierce resolve to protect the galaxy from a horror they could barely comprehend, and most crucially, the knowledge of the fire's true role as a prison. Their thoughts became a carrier wave, modulated with the chaotic anti-harmonic pattern Alara had envisioned, and fired into the heart of the nebula. For a breathless eternity, nothing happened. The plasma pillar held, the vertex symbol glowed, and the fire's tendrils tightened, threatening to snap their minds like twigs. Then, with a sound that was not a sound but a sudden inversion of perception, a shift from feeling to knowing, the nebula itself seemed to inhale. The fire's glow faltered. The vertex symbol flickered, its light stuttering as if caught in a sudden gust of cosmic wind. The plasma pillar destabilized, sputtering and collapsing inward as the feedback loop reached criticality. The fire, overloaded with the contradictory signal of both consumption and revelation, began to sputter, its flames tearing apart at the seams. Segments of its plasma collapsed into dark, cold knots that drifted away like extinguished embers. In that moment of tumult, Kaz and Alara felt their minds being pulled in opposite directions. The fire's hunger tried to claim them, while the recoil of the overloaded system tried to eject them back into the relative safety of the ship's wreckage. Their consciousness stretched thin, like a filament drawn to its breaking point, each thought a razor's edge threatening to snap. Kaz's vision narrowed to a single point. Alara's face, illuminated by the dying flare of the plasma, eyes wide with a mixture of terror and transcendence. He saw, reflected in her irises, the countless faces of those who had come before, explorers, scholars, children, all fused into a mosaic of hope and despair. He realized that if they let go now, if they surrendered to the fire's pull, they would become just another tile in that mosaic, their sacrifice silent and unheeded. Alara's thought, sharp as a shard of ice, cut through the panic. Transmit. Not a plea, not a prayer, a command. With the last vestiges of her will, she forced the transmission array to emit one final burst, a concentrated packet of the anti-harmonic signal married to a compressed archive of everything they had learned. The nature of the fire, the purpose of the nebula, the coordinates of the seal, and the warning that any attempt to harness its power would unleash the entropy beyond. The burst shot forth like a comet, a spear of pure information piercing the heart of the nebula. As it left the ship's dying frame, the fire convulsed. A shockwave of psychic energy rippled outward, tearing at the vertex symbols, shattering them into countless shards of light that scattered like snowfall across the void. The nebula's roar diminished to a whisper, then to silence, not the oppressive silence of judgment, but a quiet, expectant hush, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. Kaz felt the fire's grip loosen, its tendrils retracting as if burned by the very knowledge they had flung into its maw. His mind, frayed but intact, slammed back into the remnants of his body with a jolt that rattled his teeth. Pain exploded across his chest as a rib cracked under the strain, but he clung to consciousness, his vision swimming with afterimages of the collapsing plasma. Alara's experience was similar, yet distinct. She felt herself being pulled back through the conduit, the transmission array's final surge acting like a slingshot. Her consciousness snapped into her corporal form just as a bulkhead gave way, a torrent of superheated gas flooding the corridor. She gasped, choking on the acrid taste of ionized air, and felt the rough bite of debris against her skin as she was thrown against a console, sparks showering over her like metallic rain. The Whisper shuddered one last time, its core destabilizing. The ship's artificial gravity flickered, then failed, sending everything, not bolted down, into a slow, nauseating drift. Alarms, now reduced to frantic bleeps and bloops from dying systems, echoed through the hollow corridors. The nebula outside the fractured viewports was no longer a blazing inferno, but a dim, diffuse glow, the fire's remnants cooling into a nebular haze that pulsed faintly, like a dying heartbeat. The sudden quiet, Kaz forced his eyes open. The emergency lights cast a cruel red glow over the wreckage. He saw Alara slumped against a bulkhead, her helmet cracked, a thin line of blood tracing her temple. Despite the pain, her eyes were open, locked onto his, fierce and unyielding. "We did it," he rasped, his voice raw, half laughing, half sobbing. We sent it." Alara managed a weak smile, the corners of her mouth twitching. "The galaxy will know." The words echoed in her mind. "Will know." She coughed, a spray of blood flecking her lips. "But we—" Kaz's gaze dropped to the console beneath her hands. The transmission array, now a melted slag of alloy and crystal, still flickered faintly, its last discharge echoing in the dying electromagnetic field of the ship. A soft, almost imperceptible tone thrummed from it, a carrier wave that, though weakened, continued to propagate outward into the nebula's depths. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers. Their contact sparked a tiny surge of warmth amidst the cold ruin. "We're not done yet," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "We have to get this signal out to the array, to anyone listening." Alara nodded, pain etching lines across her forehead. The secondary beacon on the dorsal spine, it's still online. With a grunt that threatened to tear his throat, Kaz pushed himself upright, using the console for leverage. His vision swam, the world tilting as vertigo threatened to claim him. He forced his legs to move, each step a battle against the crushing weight of exhaustion and the lingering aftershock that gnawed at his bones. Alara followed, leaning heavily on him, her own steps faltering but determined. They navigated the labyrinthine wreckage of the Whisper, dodging hanging conduit bundles, avoiding ruptured fuel lines that hissed with escaping plasma, and stepping over consoles sparking with dangerous arcs. The ship groaned, a continuous low-frequency creak that sounded like the death rattle of a leviathan. Every tremor threatened to send another bulkhead collapsing. Every flicker of light threatened to plunge them into total darkness. At last, they reached the dorsal access hatch, a reinforced slab of titanium alloy that housed the secondary emergency beacon, a powerful, omnidirectional transmitter designed for deep space distress calls. The hatch was ajar, twisted by the impact, revealing a tangle of fiber optic cables and a bank of capacitors still humming with residual charge. Kaz fumbled with the manual release, his fingers slick with sweat and blood. The hatch gave with a protesting screech, swinging inward to expose the beacon's core, a cylindrical array of superconducting coils wrapped around a crystal oscillator, its surface etched with the insignia of the Scout fleet, a stylized comet streaking across a field of stars. Alara, despite her injuries, pulled herself up onto a nearby girder and peered into the beacon's interior. "The power coupling's damaged," she said, voice hoarse. "We need to jump-start it manually. If we can dump the remaining charge from the main reactor's backup cells into the beacon's initializer, we might get a full power burst." Kaz nodded, already moving toward the ruptured main reactor conduit, a thick bundle of superconducting cable that had been sheared clean in half. Sparks danced along the exposed ends, a dangerous ballet of electricity waiting to be grounded. He grasped the live end with an insulated tool scavenged from a nearby maintenance locker, feeling the charge thrum through the handle like a living thing. "Ready?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the hiss of escaping plasma. Alara swallowed, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. Do it. He slammed the live cable into the beacon's power input junction. A blinding arc of white-blue light erupted, the energy surging through the coils with a deafening crack. The crystal oscillator sang, a pure, resonant tone that filled the air, vibrating the very hull of the whisper. The beacon's emitter plates, a series of concentric rings of polished alloy, began to glow, first a dull red, then a brilliant white as the power built. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like the tearing of fabric, the beacon discharged. A colossal pulse of electromagnetic energy shot outward from the dorsal spine of the ship, a wave that rippled through the nebula's remaining plasma, igniting it briefly in a cascade of auroral ribbons that stretched for thousands of kilometers. The signal was not merely a distress call. It was a tightly modulated burst carrying the data packet they had forged, a compressed archive of the nebula's true nature, the fire's purpose, and the warning that any attempt to exploit its power would unleash the entropy that lay beyond. The pulse raced ahead of them, a beacon of truth cutting through the gloom. As it traveled, Kaz felt a strange sensation, a faint tug at the edge of his consciousness, as if the nebula itself were acknowledging the transmission, a ripple of gratitude or perhaps relief passing through the ancient entity that had lain dormant within the fire. Alara, her strength finally ebbing, slumped against the girder, her breathing shallow. Did it work?" she whispered. Kaz looked out through the fractured viewports. The nebula, once a seething maelstrom of fire and judgment, now glowed with a soft, pearlescent luminescence. The verdict symbols were gone, replaced by drifting motes of light that resembled ash caught in a gentle breeze. In the distance, beyond the nebula's veil, the pinpricks of distant stars shone steady and unaffected, their light unimpeded by the lurking horror. He pressed his forehead against the cool metal of the beacon's housing, feeling the faint vibration of the still-active transmitter thrumming through his bones. "It's out there," he said, voice trembling with a mix of awe and exhaustion. "The galaxy will know what we sacrificed. They'll know the price and the choice." Alara managed a weak laugh, the sound more a breath than a noise. "And maybe they'll choose not to reach for the fire." A sudden, violent shudder ran through the whisper as another section of the hull gave way, a groan that sounded like the final sigh of a dying beast. The emergency lights flickered, then died, plunging the corridor into absolute blackness save for the faint, pulsating glow of the beacon's emitter, now a steady, unwavering point of white light in the abyss. In that darkness, Kaz and Alara clung to each other, their bodies bruised, their minds scarred, but their will unbroken. They had stared into the heart of the galaxy's darkest secret, had felt the weight of eternity pressing upon them, and had chosen to fling that knowledge into the void rather than let it consume them silently. Outside, the nebula breathed, a slow, inhaling exhalation of cooled plasma and drifting particles, as if acknowledging the passage of information through its depths. The fire, though diminished, still simmered at its core, a dormant sentinel awaiting the next curious soul who dared to listen to its whisper. And somewhere, far beyond the glittering veil of the nebula, the signal raced onward, a beacon of truth cutting through the dark, carrying with it the last testament of two scouts who had faced the verdict and, instead of silence, chosen to scream their defiance into the cosmos. The whisper, wounded and dying, hung in the nebula's embrace, a tomb, a relay, a promise. And in the quiet that followed the burst, the only sound was the faint, steady thrum of the transmitter, a heartbeat of resistance echoing through the void, waiting for any ear willing to hear.